Welcome again to the California Horticultural Society August meeting. We meet the third Monday of the month, every month, and next month will be an in-person meeting, and we'll try to do Zoom as well. And so next month is Cal Flora Nursery in Fulton. Josh Williams, who is the relatively new owner of Cal Flora. Evidently, he was managing it and got all sorts of accolades. And I guess the other owner, it's time to retire. And so Josh will be here to present what's going on in the nursery. So that'll be next month, and that'll be in person. And so kind of what we have for in-person meetings, we'll have a walk in the garden with Josh at 4, and then 5:30, was a little bit of time to eat. We'll have a plant sale, which we'll get to see Jeff's project with a lot of plants that he's bought a little later after the rhododendron presentation. And then we'll have the live plant forum next month. So bring samples of interesting things in your garden to talk about. And then we'll have the featured presentation, and then questions and answers, and a break. And then we'll have a plant drawing afterwards. So Richard, would you like to introduce Steve?
Our speaker tonight is Steve Hootman, who is now the executive director and the curator of the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden. Rhododendrons came into botanical life back in the 19th century. There were many, there were a number of very famous collectors of plants that went to China and other parts of Asia to bring back rhododendrons to populate the great gardens of England and Scotland and Wales. And such as Rothschild's Exbury Garden, for which he built an entire railroad to bring in his plants. They're quite popular garden plants since the mid-1900s. And late in the 19th century or early 20th century, there was founded the American Rhododendron Society. And that society itself established in 1962, the Rhododendron Species Foundation, in order to bring in more species plants, because most of the plants growing, there are hundreds, there are now thousands of rhododendron hybrids. And so the species garden was intended to bring in some of the species directly from, collect the species that we had already and to bring in more from the Far East, where they come from, Bhutan, Sikkim, India, Nagaland, part of India, and various parts of Western China. Anyway, so I don't actually know what Steve's botanical education is, but since about 1992, he's worked with the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden up in Federal Way, Washington. They were given a large plot of land rent-free by Weyerhaeuser, where they located their original garden. It eventually moved, but it's still in Federal Way, Washington. And Steve has been the curator since at least 1992, I believe. And he has become later on also an executive director of the garden. So as part of his duties and interests in running the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden, he has led or co-led numerous expeditions to various countries in Asia to collect plants, mostly rhododendrons. And starting out with in China, he's led several expeditions to China, and also to later on to places in India, such as Nagaland and the Arundel Pradesh, and also, I believe, Vietnam at a later point. I became interested in rhododendrons for somebody from the Stribing Arboretum back in the 1990s or so, and that's about the same time that Steve Hootman was on the scene. And so that's how I first met him, was giving a talk to our group. And so he has brought back so many species, new species, as well as better collections of species that we already had to populate the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden. And also they have a wide distribution network now that many of the plants that he's collected, he and his co-expedition people, are now available, have been propagated at the garden and are now available for anyone to purchase. And it's not only rhododendrons, but also other plants in the Ericaceae family. And by the way, you probably don't know, but blueberries are in the Ericaceae family. And also a lot of companion plants that people plant that grow in similar conditions. And one of the things that was developed at the garden was they built a greenhouse type situation for growing Virrea rhododendrons. And now they grow a lot of their own tropical Virrea rhododendrons, which mostly come from areas where it's quite warm during the daytime, but cool at night. And so many tropical rhododendrons are now growing there as well. We live in one of the few areas in the United States where you can grow these Virrea rhododendrons outdoors. Here, Steve is probably the most knowledgeable person I know of about rhododendrons. And so I'm sure he's going to give a wonderful talk on growing rhododendrons.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Richard, for the introduction. And thank you all for inviting me this evening. Yeah, so this lecture applies more toward the or for the Pacific Northwest, but I think it will have some relevance for some of you. And if nothing else, you might see a few new plants and maybe learn a thing or two. So Meconopsis, Cardiocrinum, and Rhododendron. Meconopsis occur through this area into China. Cardiocrinums, Himalayas over to Japan. Rhododendron species, of which there are about 1,200, and with more being named constantly. 95% occur in this zone, China into the Himalayas, Japan, down through Southeast Asia, with 2 species here in northern Queensland in the highest mountains, which are Vireas, which we will look at a bit later. So many of these plants thus require the same conditions in cultivation, and they do quite well for us in the Pacific Northwest if we keep them well watered. So this is pretty typical habitat in northwestern Yunnan. This is right on the Burmese border. So if you go up and over this mountain, you're in Burma. Tibet's right here, Sichuan's right here, but we're in Yunnan currently. This could be the redwoods or here on the Olympic Peninsula. You wouldn't know any better. The difference here is the flora is much richer. It was not scraped clean in the Pleistocene. And so if you climbed around in these hills, you would find 40, 50, even 60 species of rhododendron. Whereas here you would find macrophyllum and maybe albiflorum, quite different. But otherwise, it's very similar in many ways. Native conifers. The primary difference between where the rhododendrons and cardiocrinums and Meconopsis occur is that they live in a monsoon climate. So in mid-June, the monsoon comes in off the Bay of Bengal and drops rain pretty much nonstop until October or so. Whereas, of course, in our climate, especially with you guys, but even here in the Seattle area, by mid-June, we're pretty dry and really don't get any rain until mid-October or so. So it's a maritime Mediterranean climate. So the way to keep these plants alive with us anyway is to pour a lot of water on them. So again, if you want to just say goodbye and go watch some TV or something. But yeah, a lot of these plants need a lot of water is what it comes down to. So this is, again, typical habitat. So this is a mountain called Jinfoshan in Chongqing, China, which is near Sichuan. And 2 species of rhododendron are endemic here, Platypodum, which I think I show later, and a little dwarf Medenia called Changii. And the Platypodums occur right on this edge here, where they have perfect drainage, but they can get out into the light because rhododendrons do like a lot of light. So that's one of the challenges that we face here in the Pac Northwest. And you would face even more so is giving them enough light for them to be happy without cooking them, basically. That's always the challenge. This is a place called Daoshan in Guangxi, eastern Guangxi. Probably 30, 40 species of rhododendron here. This is untouched habitat. Same mountain range. So it's these sandstone peaks as far as you can see in all directions, 360. So I've been to this place 4 times now. All looking for one specific rhododendron, which we'll see later, but it turns out to be quite rich in other species as well as many other interesting plants, all kinds of new material coming out of there. So this is a bit striking to most people. There's an alpine species. This pink stuff is Rhododendron calostrodum, which is considered an alpine dwarf species. And here it is growing in a marsh or a bog, basically. And you say, well, I thought rhododendrons liked good drainage. Well, they also like a lot of water, a lot of moisture during the growing season, as I was mentioning earlier. So this is very typical of ericaceous plants, which is the rhododendron family, and many other plants, orchids, etc. When they are in these moist conditions. So they're actually on raised hummocks. So the crown of the plant is not down in the water where it would rot, but the roots can get down into that sphagnum or into that grass or that wet area, the peat, so the plants never dry out. See, so about them full sun with constant moisture, but the crown of the plant is not sitting in the water. Very common for ericaceous plants growing in a bog. They'll be on a raised hummock of moss with their roots down in the water. Another typical habitat, this is in Western Yunnan. That's a species called Lacteum, which is an alpine, but quite difficult to grow. It's actually super easy if you have a mossy cliff with a waterfall next door, but not many of us have that, unfortunately. But that's what it likes in the wild. So trying to mimic that in the garden can be very difficult, of course, especially with global warming. Even here, we're getting hotter and drier summers. We're supposed to be in the 90s Wednesday and Thursday again. When I started at the RSF 30 years ago, if you hit a 90 somewhere in the summer, it was kind of a freak event. Now it's pretty common and a lot drier too. But that's the plant in the wild. Again, you're trying to mimic that in cultivation. Hard to do sometimes. Some of these things just do not want to grow even here in the Seattle area, but you try. So you bring a bit of seed back. This is our propagation house. We regularly produce through seed or cuttings at least 30,000 plants a year. So that stuff is distributed around the world to other botanic gardens, to some of you even, whoops. And we sell plants through our catalogs, of course, et cetera, et cetera. And here is that plant then growing in the garden. So we have had some success with this one, but that's Lacteum, which is about late April, early May, if you're ever up in the Seattle area. It's beautiful yellow, but again, very difficult to grow. So let's start with Meconopsis. So these are the poppies, not true poppies, papaver, but they are in the Papaveraceae. And of course, everybody loves the Himalayan blue poppies. You don't see many blue flowers in the wild. And so that's quite striking. These get 3, almost 4 feet tall for us. And the only reason we have success with them is because they are in this open meadow situation. This is at the garden. Wow. They have no tree root competition. And they're basically growing. Well, this area was where they had dumped a lot of sawdust back in the 70s to plant the rhododendrons. That broke down over the years into a black sludge, basically. So all the rhododendrons and maples and everything died out. And I thought, let's put some moisture loving plants there. So I brought in about 4 or 5 inches of coarse sand and put that over the top of the sludge, because again, the blue poppies never want to dry out. That's the trick. But they don't want that crown of the plant where the stem and the roots come together, what I call the crown, can't be sitting in water or they'll rot, because these are alpine plants in the wild. They occur wild in eastern Himalayas. Several species of blue poppy, actually. This is a hybrid, a fertile hybrid called Lingholm, which is a really great one. So generally Meconopsis hybrids are sterile, but this is a mutation. So we gather seed from these and make new ones every year, which is great. So that's one of our cash crops. Thank you all for keeping buying those and killing them, because that's kind of keeping us afloat right now. Thank you. Anyway, so these plants have their roots down in the old muck, but the crown of the plant is not sitting in water. And that's how we have success with them. I'm sorry, some of these are scans from old trips to the Himalayas that I did 20, 25 years ago. This is Meconopsis paniculata, which can also be blue or yellow or rose or white. I grow this especially this is the winter rosetta foliage, which is quite beautiful. And the yaks do not eat Meconopsis. They have little hairs on them, which makes them unpalatable, I guess. So you often find Meconopsis quite commonly, but that's the winter rosette, which is quite striking. Here's same species, just with golden hairs. And that's it in bloom at the garden. So that was about 3-4 weeks ago. Meconopsis integrifolia, or paniculata, sorry. This is Meconopsis horrigilis, which I've tried to grow many times. Extremely difficult. This is at 16,000 feet in Tibet. We just can't mimic those conditions, but beautiful thing. It could be sky blue or purple. This is Meconopsis punicea. I don't even try that one anymore. It's just impossible, literally. But wouldn't that be great if you could actually grow that? Meconopsis punicea and Meconopsis integrifolia. So this is the yellow lampshade poppy. And this is a place called Balangshan, which is very easy to get to if we're ever allowed to go to China again. And you go on a tour in Sichuan and you want to go see the pandas right up at where they're breeding the pandas. This is just past that. You climb a little bit higher on the mountain. And this is early June. There are literally tens of thousands of these going up the slope as far as you can see. And that's not photoshopped. These flowers are as big as Brenda's head. Stunning plant, cannot grow it. So the blue one we have luck with, the rest of them not so much. Anyway, this is Lingholm in the garden. It needs cool, to be honest, cool conditions. We're a little too hot for it even, but like I said, it never dries out. It's actually a weed in Juneau, Alaska. They'll get 6 feet tall there and seed around naturally, but they like those cool, moist summers. But come up mid-April to mid-June and you'll see these in bloom. A nice thing. Brings the crowds in anyway. There it is. This is probably about mid-May when they're at peak. Okay, Cardiocrinums are Himalayan giant lilies. There are a few other species as well, but the Himalayan species is the one that's really spectacular.
Wow.
Cardiocrinum giganteum, which occurs from Nepal in the Himalayas all the way into Western China. So this is the Himalayan form, and that's Atsuko, my propagator. Some of you might know her. So that is not Photoshop. That's 14.5 foot tall lily right there. That was our big one that year. So they can be quite impressive, and they start blooming right when the blue poppies finish. So it gives us another few weeks of color, and they like the exact same conditions. Whoops, sorry, this thing's a little touchy. Again, yeah, as Ellen mentioned, this is my wife's computer, which is a Mac, and it's kind of freaking me out right now. So, but anyway, these are the blue poppies here that have finished, and then the Cardiocrinums come on, but they like the same conditions: rich, fertile, moist soil, no tree root competition. That's variety Unanense, which comes up 2 or 3 weeks later. This is in the wild in Guizhou, China, and they often have this golden brown or reddish brown tone to the new foliage. It was quite beautiful. The Chinese form of it, the flower spikes don't get as tall, but they have a lot more color in them. This is in Western Yunnan, so where the Himalayan form is morphing into the Chinese form, and here on the Burma border, the flowers come out a really nice green yellow and then slowly fade to white. I don't have that one any longer. This is the inland China. So this is like from Guangxi, Guizhou in China. And they're about half the height of the giganteum from the Himalayas, but they bloom 2 or 3 weeks later, and you get a lot of color. You see all the red in the tepals, quite striking. So that's late June with us. And these come back every year. Another shot.
No.
Not too bad, because most of the rhododendrons have finished by now. I'm not sure if anybody's growing these down there. They can take a bit of heat, but again, you're going to need some shade in the afternoon and a lot of moisture. But a beautiful thing. Here's June in the Pac Northwest. I still have my fleece on. Isn't that great? And then you get these great seed heads that stay up for a year or two even afterward, and they produce thousands of seed, which you can sow. We leave them in place and they come up on their own, but it takes 2 years to germinate. And putting, sorry, that's my dog, sorry, working at home. So the mother bulb, when it puts up that giant stalk, it does kind of burn itself out. It is technically monocarpic, and it will kill itself. It'll take 7, 8, 9 years from seed to flower. But like many lilies, it does produce daughter bulbs. So you see there are 3 or 4 attached here. And some people take the trouble to go in and dig those up and divide them and spread them out. I don't have the manpower for that. We just leave them in place, and you wait a year or two, and then those bloom and they die. But then there are more daughter bulbs. So you don't really ever lose the clump. And they just keep going, which is great. Other plants that like the same conditions that we do well with. So there's the Cardiocrinum in the back, that big pale green hosta looking thing. The Primula pulverulenta, the Iris siberica, or no, that's silver edge. All these things like the exact same conditions. So if you happen to have those conditions, you can grow these moisture loving plants. Iris chrysographes and Primula prolifera. Those are both Asian species that do quite well together as well. And Primula secundiflora. I used to have a big area of this from Sichuan as well, but those have all died out as well. All the candelabras are quite easy in cultivation and do well, at least for us in the Pac Northwest. I really like this one with the black and white striped calyx covered with the white farina. Beautiful thing. Whoops, going the wrong way, sorry. All right, now we move on to rhododendrons. And of course, I think many of you know, yes, you can grow quite a few rhododendrons down in your area, especially depending upon what side of the hill you're on, of course, and where the fog comes in and all of that. But I know a lot of people down there, of course, that grow a lot of species and hybrids. It's just a little more difficult than here. And you can't grow quite the range outside that we can up here where it's cooler. But again, temper all about what I'm about to say, because you would need a bit more shade. With us, I'm constantly struggling because we are tree country. I'm constantly struggling to keep the light levels correct. So here you see where I've taken out 4 Western red cedars and 1 big native hemlock to open this area up. Here's what was growing out from under those conifers was salal. This used to be all rhododendrons. So now this is a very open, exposed area full of azaleas and magnolias and all kinds of things. So with us, that's a constant battle to keep the trees thinned out and limbed up, et cetera, to keep the light levels up, but at the same time, not have the plants be too hot. So that's an issue we're running into now with all these 90-degree days, or 108 as we hit last June, which was really fun. That was quite damaging. But they still like their light as long as they're getting watered. And so this is looking uphill toward the alpine garden and gazebo you see in the top left corner. I've taken out maybe 70 trees from this image over the last 30 years, but I have yet to have a person come in and say what happened to all the trees. We still have lots and lots of trees, but again, it's finding that the proper balance. So now with the thinning, I've been really pushing on thinning and limbing, et cetera, and we've really started to get some good bloom going again. So here you see things really covered with flowers. The rhodies require less water and are less stressed in the shade, but you get less flowers, of course, and less fall color. So again, it's just finding that balance under your climatic conditions. Quinquefolium, this is a Japanese 5-leaved azalea. Didn't used to bloom like that. Took a bunch of trees out, and now these 60, 70-year-old Japanese azaleas are blooming once again. That's a stunning thing. And again, here you see there's Edgeworthii and Augustinii and Luteum and Sino Grande all doing quite well, even though they are technically in the forest with all these big Doug firs. But there's now enough light coming in. Same thing. Just thin that out a bit. Now all the big leaves are blooming well. Here you see Rhododendron rex underplanted with ostrich fern, Matuxia, and Polygonatum. It's another form of rex. So we're getting really good blooming on these. So again, if these were out in hot afternoon sun, the leaves would be a lot smaller and you'd have foliar discoloration burning. So it's keeping that hot afternoon sun away, but giving them as much light as possible. Sanal falconeri is another big leaf that does quite well. This is one I would recommend people down there trying. It is from northern Vietnam, so it's used to some heat, but is also quite cold tolerant and a very vigorous grower. It'll put on 18 inches to 2 feet a year, and has these beautiful cream to yellow flowers. Just a stunning thing. So this is kind of what we do. So we don't really have topsoil in the garden, thanks to the Pleistocene and some Weyerhaeuser logging and all that sort of thing. It's basically just hard pan clay and cobblestones. And then, like I said, back in the 70s, they brought in like 30,000 yards of sawdust from the sawmills and put that on top of the clay. And that's what I inherited in 92. So since then, we've been building raised beds of coarse sand, which I went to soil gravel people through the whole Puget Sound area looking for the right sand. Found this one place that had good coarse, really coarse angular sand, and I've been getting it from them ever since. So now we build up raised beds on top of the missing soil, And what we do here, just to get us through, again, the winter, when it can be, as you know, quite rainy up here. So you don't need these now dormant plants in the winter sitting in wet soil. So we build raised beds of sand. And then even then, we plant the new rhododendrons that go out in the garden on a slight mound. See, this is all raised bed right here. And then you plant on a several inch high mound. And you say, well, I don't want humps all through my garden. Well, what we do then is bring in, we take the branches and down trees and have them all chipped and let them sit for a year or two. So you've got the green brown combo, it's good stuff. We bring that in, and out here you put it really deep. And then as you get close to the crown of the plant, then you make it thinner. So in the end, it looks like you have a nice even level bed, see, but these plants are perched up. So the roots are never gonna, they're never gonna be sitting in water. And they also now have something to hang on to with that coarse sand. See, I've been doing that for 30 years now. Most of the garden's been built up with raised beds actually, but it's taken a while. But as I said, when I started, it was basically rotten sawdust. And so the plants were either dead from the root rot or had fallen over because they had nothing to hang on to, see. So with that sand, you have something permanent. Also, what happens with this is the chips we bring in, our own shredding and all that stuff, plus the natural debris from the dug fir trees, etc., the cones, the needles, the little branches, we leave all that. And eventually the zone where the sand and the mulch meet, that turns into a really good sandy loam. And that's exactly where all the root activity is, all the root growth and all the physiology is taking place. That's where the food is, that's where the oxygen is, et cetera, et cetera. So that works quite well for us. Again, you adapt this to your own conditions. You might have great soil, et cetera, et cetera. But this is just an issue where we have drainage problems, and that's not a good thing in a wet Seattle winter. That's the coarse sand. So I have it mixed with bark. There's a lot of gravel, rocks in it. Really, I mean, that's drainage. You don't have to worry about drainage with this. And here you see, we had a big ice storm about 10 years ago, which took out a couple of hundred trees, including maple. You know, we lost the entire birch collection, et cetera, et cetera. There's a birch right there, actually. But anyway, so that opened up some new areas, which were the old sawdust. So we brought in a ton of that sand, built these raised beds, and now we have some beautiful plants growing here. Same thing, this was all bamboo. That took me many, many years to finally kill off. And then we were able to bring in that coarse sand and build some raised beds. And this is one of the most, this was 5 years ago, I think. And this is one of the most beautiful spots in the garden now. These are the chips we use. So that's our own, you know, dug fir branches, trees you thin. We chip that all up and like I said, let it sit for a year or two to brown out a bit and to burn off a bit. And then that makes a beautiful mulch. And that's all we use for fertilizer. So going back to that, so you put this on, and as it breaks down, the species don't need a lot of food. Think back to that lactium, the yellow one growing on the cliff next to the waterfall. There's no soil there, there's nothing. I mean, it's basically feeding off of any debris falling like its own leaves or needles from the conifers overhead. But it's a steady, you know, breakdown of organic matter, so that we try to mimic that in cultivation here and don't throw a bunch of, you know, factory produced nitrogen and stuff all over the garden, because you're going to throw the balance out and you're going to kill off a lot of mycorrhizae and a lot of the microorganisms. And you're going to favor the ones that like that sort of thing, like some of the bacterial and viral and fungal pathogens that all feed on nitrogen. So our plants get nitrogen from the natural breakdown of the mulch initially, and then the dug fir needles and cones and things that we leave in place, and the fallen leaves and flowers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a recycling of nutrients constantly without throwing tons of inorganic fertilizer in to throw the balance out of whack. So we don't have very many disease issues. Fortunately, rhododendrons can be moved quite easily. This is a big Hemsleyanum. And I basically just cut a disc with a spade and then get under there with the tractor and pop it and then put it in its new home. Oh, that's that corner I was just showing when it was full of bamboo. So that bamboo is gone finally. Sometimes Federal Way, which is south of Seattle, actually just north of Tacoma, is a convergence zone. So unfortunately for the garden, whenever there's an ice or heavy snow event, we get hit really hard. So I lose a lot of material from ice storms. This was one we had 4 years ago, I think. And these are some of the original plants that had survived the old rotten sawdust, which are about 25 feet tall Rhododendron fortunii. So the evergreen leaves held onto that snow and ice, and they tipped right out of the ground because, again, there's nothing for them to hang on to. So I thought, okay, I either make some really great firewood here and then bring some of that sand in and start all over, or we try to pull these guys back up and give us that great super mature rhododendron forest look again, which is what we decided in the end. So I went to our local rock dealer up in the mountains and got 3 tons of basalt and had him dump it there. And then we hooked up the tractor with the come along and pulled all 4 of those up and dumped that basalt on the root base. And those plants took right off. They didn't flinch. And they're still there today. So still looking good. Just popped them back in the hole. You can prune rhododendrons. I don't recommend it. If a plant's too big for its site, put something smaller there. This isn't at the garden. This is a friend's house, actually. I don't recommend that. One little tip, if you do have rhododendrons and you want to prune things, the rough barked or normal barked ones like this one respond better generally. The smooth barked ones do not like being pruned hard. So if you have a smooth bark rhododendron, don't mess with it. These are some of the brushy, like azalea or doricum or microniolitum, which are kind of brushy things, respond very well to pruning back. So these are plants that have gotten big and leggy and grown over the path. So we just went in and knocked them all back to 2 or 3 feet. And now they're nice, dense, beautiful blooming plants again. Okay, competition. So I could do a whole lecture just on this. This is what it all kind of comes down to with a lot of plants, but especially rhododendrons. There are certain plants that are very difficult to grow that do not have competition in the wild. So they're not adapted to that sort of thing. Certain things like this Valentinianum affinity from northern Vietnam, I struggle to grow. It's hardy, great plant that would be a very popular garden plant, but it's difficult to keep alive. It grows on vertical cliff faces at 10,000 feet in northern Vietnam. So not an easy habitat to mimic. Same thing for Forestii. This is a little red-belled fellow from Tibet. Occurs right where glaciers are melting, basically, and the red bells pop out as soon as the snow melts off. Probably never gets to 50 degrees. It never dries out. Here's one at a friend's house growing in a stump. No tree root competition. So as long as he keeps that watered, you're good to go. It has no competition. Same thing with Proteoides, is a little dwarf Taliensia, another alpine species, very difficult to grow. I have this in a raised bed outside the conservatory. There are no tree roots. It's got perfect drainage. It gets shade from 1 o'clock in the afternoon on, so it doesn't get too hot. And that's probably one of the best Proteoides you're ever going to see in the world, actually, just because it's in the right spot. And Dachengensi, which is a new little species. This is the one I went looking for 4 times in the Daiyoshan in Guangxi. Finally found it. We don't have time to get into all this. Very mysterious plant. It's related to the one I just showed you, but it's 1,500 miles away, growing in the subtropics, but quite happy. So don't know about that. But anyway, interesting thing. That was growing on vertical sandstone cliffs. No competition, but actually I found this to be relatively easy in cultivation so far. Epiphytes. So a lot of ericaceous plants, including rhododendrons, are epiphytes in the wild, either obligate or just because they can. Like on the Yunnan Burma border, the Salween River is incredibly wet during the monsoon season. I've seen big hemlock trees with 20-foot rhododendron sinograndes, which is a big leaf, growing out of the top of them. Normally, sinogrande is a woodland or forest plant that grows under the trees in the soil, but it's wet enough there that sinogrande can be an epiphyte because it never dries out. So that's the different. Obligate epiphyte is, these are plants that are always epiphytic. That's just the way they grow in the wild. So a lot of the Medenia are that way. This is a new one, Lavinia, which you don't need to hear about hardiness, but this one's very exciting because it's a fragrant dwarf hardy Medenia. So you guys can do Medenias outside like Natalii and Lindley and Rhabdodon and all these fantastic plants. that have big, beautiful, fragrant flowers. We can't do those outside, but it turns out if you just go south and east in China and Asia, Vietnam, the plants become more dwarf and they become hardier. So I have this growing outside. It's one of my new favorites. Lavinia, that's the new foliage.
Wow.
Sanguensi is an Edgeworthii relative from northern Burma, northwest Yunnan. Beautiful foliage, thick indumentum, little yellow flowers. That's an epiphyte in the wild. I've always seen that just growing on the sides of trees, kind of hanging down pendulous. So it can be quite hard to grow if it doesn't have drainage. Again, the epiphytes, you're thinking of an orchid or a bromelia. They need really great drainage, but they don't like to dry out too much. Excellence is another one. This is similar to Natalia, which some of you maybe have seen or even grow, but for us is hardy. This is from North Vietnam. And Leptocladon. So these are some of the new species that we found over the last 20, 30 years. This is a yellow flowered one from North Vietnam, which is hardy for us. But again, it needs the drainage. Edgeworthii itself is a very famous plant. You'll see that at stribing, and some of you probably even grow it. Very fragrant, beautiful foliage, beautiful flowers, great plant. But again, you need really good drainage. In the wild, that grows basically on old snags and dead stumps, is where you see that in the wild. And that's Rhabdodendron. That's blooming right now in the conservatory. I can't do this outside up here. You guys can do this one outside. Those fade to pure white with red stripes as they age. So that's a stunning thing. Yeah, you guys, if you are able to water, that's one. I mean, who wouldn't want to have that in their garden? So one of the ways we've dealt with growing some of the epiphytes is working with the Hardy Fern Foundation. Back in 2009, we put in a Victorian stumpery. So I cleared out another slope covered with bamboo right above the pond there. And we brought in 9 truckloads of stumps and logs and placed them around underneath the Doug fir canopy. And then brought in some soil and brought in ferns and epiphytes and big leaves. And so this is basically one giant raised bed with a lot of old, dead, rotten snags and logs. And it's actually a lot more cool now. We started planting agapetes and rhododendron because these old logs, most of them weren't old enough for plants to root into. They were still too hard, right? So 10 years later, they've rotted down to where I can just take a knife or a screwdriver and jab out a hole and plug a little cutting or a seedling in, and it roots into that old wood, see? So some of these old stumps like this, the inside of that is old rotten wood, which is quite moist. So again, you've got the constant moisture, but the perfect drainage. So if you have old stumps and logs, utilize them. So yeah, these guys are all rotted down quite a bit now. And we have little gesneriads and pleone orchids and all kinds of things growing up there. Here's one of the old stumps that came out of the garden that was already rotten. So here we've got epiphytic rhododendrons and pyrosia ferns and all kinds of things growing on this old stump. So that's kind of what the rest of the stumpery looks like now. It's actually completely green. You can't even see wood anywhere now because the ferns and moss have naturalized. This is a species called Boothii that's growing on an old stump. So an old cedar stump, you just scrape out a little rotten wood and stick it in there. That's exactly where it grows in the wild. There's a Sino Grande growing on an old stump. I planted that with the Sorbus. That's still there doing well, just because. Again, there's Edgeworthii, the one I showed earlier. That's exactly where you would find that plant growing in the wild, on top of an old dead stump. Perfectly happy. This is an Edgeworthii hybrid called Plover. And so, as Richard mentioned, we did build a conservatory back in, it opened in 2010 to display the Virea collection. So the Vireas are the truly tropical rhododendrons, most of which are epiphytic in the wild. So they occur in Indonesia, Malaysia, New Guinea, et cetera, et cetera. And we've always had that collection, but we've never been able to show it to the public. So this is right up at the top of the garden near the entrance. And we have at least 24 things in bloom inside every day of the year. So obviously spring is the most, but it has orchids, tree ferns, begonias, tropical rhododendrons, et cetera, et cetera. Here are some of the Vireas. So you, as Richard mentioned, if you're in a good spot down in your area, you can grow these outside. They have them at Stribing, many other places. but we get too cold up here, so we have to keep them in a heated greenhouse in the winter. And we do let the conservatory cool down to the high 30s, so it's not really tropical. It's a temperate house, but we don't let it freeze. So here's Blackie Eye, High Mantodes with the great scales,
That's cute.
Brickianum, Stenophyllum with the long narrow leaves. These are all in the conservatory if you come up for a visit. Taxifolium is an extinct species was found on one mountain in the Philippines. Really cool conifer-like foliage. The Peony orchids, this is actually, we have those inside, but this is a rock wall outside of the conservatory where I have now naturalized Peony formosana. So they have spread, all these cracks are full of Peony orchids now. And the reason they survive is because the bulbs, which are dormant in the winter, the overhead rocks shed the constant rain. They don't want to be soggy and freezing in the winter. So that's the trick. If these were planted up on top in the raised bed, they would rot out first winter. So underneath these rock crevices, then they're protected in the winter. So that's quite a sight in April when that whole wall is covered with orchids like this. That's the same species. Excuse me. All right, companion plants. So things that we grow with rhododendrons. So I focus on plants that grow naturally with rhododendrons in the wild because it looks more natural, it's more aesthetically pleasing, and obviously they like the same conditions. So I'm not going to plant cactus underneath rhododendron lacteum because they like different cultivations. So this is a great spreader for us. This is the native ramps from Europe. If you've been to a woodland garden in Germany or the UK in May, you'll see, as far as you can see under the beech and oak, in certain places, Allium ursinum, which is a great little onion, naturalizes, and then the foliage dies down by late June. So it's a spring ephemeral. Erasemas do really well for us. They grow naturally with rhododendrons in the wild. This is Erasima sicocianum from Japan. Peonia marii, this is my own intro from Sichuan. That's a woodland peony. So even with us, that it wants to be in the shade. So we grow that with trilliums, hostas, ferns, etc. But it is a beautiful woodland peony species. Ypsilandra tibetica, lily relative evergreen lily, blooms in late February, March for us. Blue anthers on the white flowers and extremely fragrant. Really fantastic plant, Ypsilandra. Kristen was talking about hardy gesneriads earlier. Hardy here means something different, of course. I've been collecting hardy gesneriads for the last dozen years or so in China and Vietnam. This is my favorite one so far. This is Brigsia speciosa, which I do grow outside in our climate, so it can take quite a bit of cold, but huge. That's blooming right now. That's on my porch right out back here, actually. And those flowers are at least 2 inches long. It's an evergreen rosette, like an African violet family, the Gesneriaceae. So we have a big collection of these going now at the garden. Some of the good trees to grow with rhododendrons that occur with rhododendrons in the wild. This is Davidia, of course, dove tree or handkerchief tree. We have 3 large ones in the garden. They does quite well here. That's the actual flower, of course, that little ball of purple with the big bract. And I know that this is grown down in your area in certain places anyway. Another plant from the same forests of Himalayas into China is, this is a collection of mine from '95 called Tetracentron sinensis. So it's kind of like ginkgo. It's this ancient linking genus between conifers and angiosperms. It bears catkins, and it's the only genus in its family, and this is the only species in its genus. So it's a dinosaur relic sort of thing. One of my favorite trees in the garden, Tetracentron, beautiful foliage, turns bright yellow in the fall. Magnolias, of course, grow naturally with rhododendrons in the wild. We don't do the hybrids. All the Solangianas and that, I don't have room for that. And those tend to have very aggressive root systems anyway, the hybrid magnolias. But the species do occur naturally with the rhododendrons in the wild. This is Abo Veda, the big leaf magnolia from Japan. Styracaceae, again, grows in the same forest with rhododendrons in the wild. So you're looking at Styrax huanus. You probably have Styrax japonicus down there, many other species. and a lot of other genera. So that's one of our primary tree sub collections in the garden. Here's one that I collected in Guizhou, which is Styrex odoratissima that just finished blooming. Not too bad. Styrex, this is winged Styrex. So this is now a 25-foot tree from seed I collected in 2010. Good grower, giving us some decent shade. But at the end of May, this is the most spectacular plant in the garden. Those hanging panicles of fringed white bells are a foot long each on the long outstretched branches. That is a beautiful flowering tree. That's one that we'll have to get down to some gardens in your area because it's a low elevation Chinese thing, so it should have quite a bit of heat tolerance. Styrex lavilliana. And Elnophyllum is another one. This is a low elevation species. I have it in the garden. It keeps growing into the winter and so gets damaged once in a while, but it's a beautiful large flowered thing that I think would be happier down your way with some heat. And my favorite, this is Rhododendron. They have this at Striving right on the edge of the courtyard there outside the main office building / library, whatever that one's called. I don't remember, but there's one there. It's not doing great. It does better up here. I think it's too hot down in your area, but Rhododendron xylocarpum is a Styraceae relative, probably the most beautiful flowering tree I've ever seen in the wild. It's a stunning, these are upside down pink parasols that are 1.5 inches across, and it's just loaded, the whole tree. Hemimelidaceae is another family that occurs quite commonly with rhododendrons in the wild. This is Dicanthus cercidifolius. Great fall color. That's starting to color already, and it will, if we don't have a hard frost, have color into December with us. Of course, other rhododendron relatives, ericaceous things. This is Enkianthus seriolatus, which is a low elevation Enkianthus. It's the one that blooms before the foliage. The other species all bloom in May after the leaves emerge, but this one's always pure white and it blooms in March before the leaves come out. Enkianthus deflexus, this is all through the Sino-Himalaya, quite variable. Enkianthus chinensis, I've seen white, yellow, pink, striped, red, quite variable as well. This is a Menziesea from Japan called Cilia calyx, which has now been lumped into the genus Rhododendron. So that's actually Rhododendron benhallii, but this is a weird form from seed collected wild in Japan that blooms in March with pale yellow flowers. All the other Menzieseas have pink or purple flowers in May, like this one. This is my own name selection called Plum Drops. That's just a dwarf version of the one I just showed you. Stays quite small and compact with really large dark purple flowers. Gaultherias, of course, there are a lot of species through the Sino-Himalaya. We have our own salal. This is Gaultheria pseudonotabilis, which is one that I introduced from the Salween back in '97, and that's a new species, which we can't grow outside. But if any of you can get a hold of that from us or our other gardens, a stunning foliage plant. This is Leucothoe racemosa, just showing. So Ericaceae is our prime sub collection besides rhododendrons. So we have, I think, the largest collection of ericaceous plants in North America. This is Leucothoe racemosa from back east in the Appalachians. And of course, Agapetes, which you guys can do outside. We can do the Vietnamese species outside. They're hardy, but the Himalayan and the Chinese species like this Pyrolifolia can only go down to about 20. So, but these are basically really showy epiphytic evergreen blueberries, basically. Here's that same species. This is how I grow them at home. I'd put them in a moss-lined basket and have them hanging. So you get the drainage. There you see the lignotuber, and their pendulous habit can be enjoyed better that way. So that's how I grow them anyway. If you have an old stump or a snag or something, that's where they'd be growing in the wild. But this way you don't have, because they are epiphytes, you don't have to worry about drainage this way. And then if it gets too cold, I just throw it inside the shed and hang it up in there for a couple of days. This is Agapetes oblonga, and the Agapetes do form this big lignotuber. Even where they grow wild, you can experience maybe a week of no rain. So this way, when you're stuck on the side of a tree, they have a little bit of water to back them up. Quite common. This is a vaccinium actually from North Vietnam called Vaccinium pseudobellatum, which has huge evergreen leaves like this, and these big 1-inch wide, dark red flowers, which you don't see often in a blueberry. This, I think, is probably a vaccinium, but it's a link with Vaccinium agapetes. I love the foliage on this one, and the beautiful two-tone flowers. Then you get a blueberry following these flowers, which is actually looks like a pure white pearl, little glossy white pearl, beautiful thing. Oh, there it is right there, yeah. This is one of the ones we can grow outside, Agapetes malapoensis, which is from North Vietnam. It has some hardiness for us. And that's the fruit of that species. So it's a blueberry, but it's red. Agapetes ligevin cross. This is one of my favorite genera. We have a huge collection here. I'm adding more all the time. And we sell tons of these every year. California people eat these up. Agapetes serpens, I had fruit form 1 year out of 30. Don't know why, but we did get a big crop of blueberries that year. And Smithiana major, which is one of the yellow ones. This is an unknown species from Eastern Himalaya. Just showing some of the variation. They're beautiful things if you grow this sort of plant. These do well in your climate. They like a bit of heat as well. Agapetes lacei. And what I was calling Miniata, but it's not Miniata, it's a new species, which is our most stunning one. So it's starting to bloom right now, and it will flower into December with these huge dark pink chevron lined flowers. Just a beautiful thing. This is also how I grow orchids. So Collagenes grow with Agapetes and rhododendrons in the wild. And so I grow them. They like the same temperature regime, so they do well in our greenhouses. And again, you get the good drainage here. This is Collagenea cristata, the queen. Maybe some of you grow that famous old plant. Cymbidium hookerianum, again, in the conservatory. And some of the gesneriates. So Lysionotus is a genus that I'm really into right now. This is the common widespread pauciflorus, but it can be quite variable. This is actually right now in my backyard a couple of years ago, but it's blooming right now. And I line these orchid or water lily baskets with moss because these plants are strongly stoloniferous. So this pot now, which is hanging in a tree in my backyard, there are long shoots coming out on the bottom and all the sides all the way around. It's just a big ball of foliage with flowers hanging out, and the hummingbirds are all over it, and you don't have to worry about root weevils or moles or anything. So that's a good way to grow some of these, again, when you have drainage issues. But I really love the Lysionotus. They're evergreen, and there are several species: blue, purple, white, pink. I have a yellow one now that I just collected in South Yunnan that we're selling or have sold, Lysionotus petalatii with beautiful cream yellow flowers, just stunning. Same thing with Eschinanthus. This is a species I collected in Eastern Himalayas with the long narrow leaves. And it's planted in this ball here, you see, that's lined with moss. So then the shoots come out all the way around the ball. This one is Eschinanthus buxifolius, which is super hardy for us. So this one I actually collected a cutting of this from an old stump in Vietnam, and I planted it on an old stump in Federal Way, and it's quite happy there. And this plant now has suckers or runners coming out through the bark all the way around the stump. It's quite beautiful, and that one is hardy for us outside. Eschinanthus buxifolius, evergreen. Yeah, there it is. Blooms in late summer, early fall. All right, we're almost finished here, folks. Failure and success. I've had a lot of failure, I suppose a lot of success too. Basically, people in my position, I get paid to kill plants, so kind of fun in a way. Hopefully it doesn't happen too much, but for instance, here's Papua New Guinea back in 2011. So this is a bog species, Rhododendron saxifragoides. It's a little clump or evergreen. It sends long runners through the sphagnum peat moss and then puts up another rosette of leaves. I did get seed of that, and we had 86 plants, I think, originally from that seed. As of now, we have 0. But we tried everything. I mean, I even put it in hypertufa with live sphagnum sitting in water in the conservatory so that it would never dry out. Like I said, it grows in sphagnum in the wild. Even that one died. So just some things you just can't grow. Have had some success though. This is Rhododendron falconeri, a big leaf from seed I collected in the Eastern Himalaya in '97. Those finally started blooming a few years ago, so I had to be patient. But again, I did have success and was able to see that come into its glory. Same with the Kasengi. Waited 15, 20 years for that, but finally, there it is. And sometimes things work out. And we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve. Time for some questions. I had a couple questions come in through the chat.
Okay, sure.
How do you refurbish the stumpery?
We won't really. It's just going to break down slowly over the years. When it gets to a point where it's just a big ferny mound, maybe we'll bring some fresh stumps in, but there's not much we can do now. It's in those pictures I showed you are from 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's completely green now. A lot of the ferns have really naturalized. We do extra water in there, and so it's really mossy. And like I said, I've planted epiphytes everywhere, so it's basically what it is until it breaks down into rotten goo. One of the issues with the stumps is we have a lot of pileated woodpeckers, and you have those down there, of course. And when the stumps get rotten enough where they're attracting insects, so you'll plant all these really cool rare plants in there that look great, and then a pileated finds it and destroys the whole thing. So that's, but that's just part of it, you know, rhododendron farming.
And then Mark was asking about the agapetes, hoping Steve will describe ideal growing conditions for agapetes, light water pot size.
They can become quite large, but like I said, I've kept many of them alive in those hanging baskets for years because they are epiphytes, so they're used to a restricted root run. So you grow them like an orchid, basically. You don't want to overpot your orchid, right? Same thing. Once they fill out the container or that hanging basket or whatever, they will say, okay, I'm finished, and they will start flowering more heavily. I pitched them back quite hard for a couple of years to get them to branch out, because some of them will literally put out an 8-foot long shoot. Just that's it. So if you pinch them back hard for a couple of years, you get a much more dense habit. And because they are epiphytic in the wild and they do have that lignotuber, you don't have to water them every day. If they have a good healthy root system, which they would eventually in a hanging basket like that, they are adapted to some drought. So I don't have to water that stuff all that often, as long as they're not out in hot, full sun.
About how big a
Same as a
hanging
rhododendron, a lot of light, but not, they don't want to bake in the afternoon sun.
Did you have another question, Mark?
Oh, just the side, a hanging basket. So one of those with the, like you showed, with the kind of a wire frame and moss or something to keep some soil in.
Right.
And about how large would you say? A couple feet across?
Oh, that's a big one. You could grow several in that, or have one. The
good. It could be smaller.
Yeah, if I usually use much smaller. That's going to be really heavy for one thing, and you're sort of over potting unless you're putting 3, 4 different things in.
No, okay.
And you guys could do that.
Good.
Yeah, do a smaller one. I get these plastic black ones, which maybe I showed from Andy's Orchids down in Southern California. He'll ship them to you. And then I just go collect moss in the woods and line those baskets. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
This is Beryl. I have a question about the basalt. I just saw, relatively large basalt pieces of rock. Is that what you did?
Yeah.
And the purpose of that was just to prop up the trees?
Well, we pulled up the tree trunk, the tree rhododendrons that had fallen over from the ice, right? So they got ripped out by the roots. So we pulled them back up so that the roots were back down on the ground. And then I just dumped the rocks on top of the root base to hold the plant down.
And also to prop up the trees also, or just on top?
Well, we put some branches underneath to help hold them up, but the rocks are the main part. I mean, it's going to take a lot of weight to pull those rocks up into the air. So
Oh, wow.
it's both. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Interesting.
Thank you.
All righty. Thank you so much, Steve. That was really interesting and a lot of plant envy. And
Yeah, sorry about that.
of course, everybody wants, everybody will try a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Yeah, some of that stuff does down well in your area, though. I've been to a lot of gardens down there, and I've seen a lot of these plants. So, all right, well, maybe we'll see you all up in the garden next spring or whenever. Let me know if you're coming up. I'll show you around a bit.
Definitely a destination spot for sure. I'm gonna.
Yeah, everybody come up if you can. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a little bit
Oh,
different from your area, but some overlap.
So what would you say, spring, late spring?
Yeah, mid-March to mid-May is when you'll see the most color, and it differs week to week. I mean, literally day to day. So,
I'm sure, yeah.
but anytime in March, April, or May is really spectacular if you want to see rhododendron flowers. We have some right now that are in full bloom, but not like in spring. So,
Thank you so much.
you
Thanks
bet.
again.
Thank
Thank you.
It was a great
Yeah.
presentation.
That's all, folks. Remember to come to next month in person, and we're gonna try to do the Zoom thing for you folks that are not able to get into San Francisco. Good night, everybody.
Night.